To become a naturalized American citizen, you have to clear one final hurdle: the U.S. Civics Test. The 2025 version of the test features 128 possible questions. Question 65 asks you to name 3 rights of everyone living in the United States. The accepted answers are straightforward: freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. Memorizing these answers creates a specific image of how America works. It suggests that these freedoms are absolute and that they are automatically granted the moment they are written down. But the right to vote tells a very different story. The history of the ballot in America is a constant tug-of-war between federal ideals and state-level restrictions. Passing the civics test means knowing the written rules. But understanding America requires knowing that a right on a piece of paper means very little without the power to enforce it. Look at questions 95 and 96 on the test. They ask what the Emancipation Proclamation did and which war ended slavery. The answers are the Civil War and the legal end of slavery starting in 1862. The test follows this up with question 97, the 14th Amendment granting citizenship, and question 98, the 15th Amendment, which states that all men got the right to vote. The Constitution established those rights, but Southern state legislatures immediately responded by building systems designed to bypass the 15th Amendment and keep Black citizens from the polls. Because the Constitution left election administration to the states, local officials created impossible hurdles. They designed highly subjective literacy tests. They enacted grandfather clauses, which exempted white voters from these tests if their ancestors had been eligible to vote before the war. They also instituted poll taxes, turning the ballot box into a financial toll booth. On this 1954 Texas poll tax receipt, notice the field: race, white, or colored. Decades after the 15th Amendment, these state barriers remained institutionalized and explicitly tied to race. These loopholes were devastatingly effective. By 1910, in places like Louisiana, less than 1% of eligible Black voters were successfully registered. For nearly a century, the official civics test answer, that all men secured the right to vote after the Civil War, was effectively a lie in the American South. Question 99 asks you to name a leader of the women's rights movement in the 1800s, like Susan B. Anthony. That leads directly to question 102, which teaches that the 19th Amendment gave all women the right to vote in 1920. But the mainstream suffrage movement frequently sidelined Black women in order to secure the support of white Southern lawmakers. So while white women gained access to the polls in 1920, Southern Zothranling remained violently disenfranchised. The exclusions went further. Native Americans were not legally considered citizens until the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, and Asian Americans faced strict naturalization bans until 1952. Question 63 asks about constitutional amendments expanding voting. Securing those protections required the blood and sacrifice of the 1960s civil rights movement. Look at the wall of state troopers here in Selma, Alabama. This is the physical embodiment of state-level suppression blocking a federal right. This nonviolent direct action forced Congress to act. The result was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which established a policy called federal preclearance. It required states with a history of discrimination to get federal approval before changing their election laws, finally striking down literacy tests and mandating state compliance. The idealized answers you memorize for the civics test only became a reality on the ground because citizens forced the federal government to step in and override state-level discrimination. This brings us to the baseline vulnerability of the American electoral system. The text of the Constitution explicitly grants individual states the broad authority to dictate voter qualifications and manage their own elections. Over the last decade, the United States Supreme Court has systematically dismantled the core protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. In decisions like Shelby County and Brnovich, the court struck down the preclearance formula and raised the burden of proof for plaintiffs. This made it exponentially harder to challenge discriminatory state voting laws. The fallout is a spike in restrictive laws heading into 2025. States are implementing strict voter ID and proof of citizenship mandates. Looking closely at the borders, a clear fracture emerges. An American's ability to cast a ballot depends entirely on their zip code. Passing the 2025 civics test requires memorizing the amendments. But being an American citizen requires accepting a harder truth. The right to vote is never permanently won. It requires an endless defense against disenfranchisement.